Raz, dwa, trzy, test, próba, test, transmisja, transmisja, próba transmisji, hej, 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 próba transmisji, transmisja, transmisja, hej, 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 transmisja, transmisja, hej, 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 raz, dwa, trzy, słuchaj. Okay.
Dzień dobry, chciałbym Państwa wszystkich tutaj zebranych bardzo serdecznie powitać. Dzisiaj od godziny 9:30 do 10:30 będzie tutaj na scenie panel dotyczący wojny i dezinformacji, roli mediów właśnie w wojnie i dezinformacji. Moderatorem będzie pan Michael Murphy z The Telegraph.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us for what I'm sure is going to be an insightful and hopefully riveting discussion on the topic of the media's role in disinformation. I'd like to begin by offering some background to the term disinformation, which has only recently entered or intruded upon our everyday language. And then I'll conclude by posing some questions that I think we should all bear in mind throughout the discussion before handing over to the panel. Disinformation is defined by the Cambridge Dictionary as false information spread in order to deceive people. This is nothing new, of course, and formerly came under the umbrella term propaganda, which was in some ways a less weighted term. For example, it was an unremarkable fact of life in Europe and America during the World Wars that each side would use propaganda. Indeed, George Orwell, the great author on totalitarianism, himself worked for a time as a radio propagandist for the BBC. But propaganda has been largely eclipsed by this new term, disinformation, and perhaps rightly so. Propaganda covers everything from spin to deliberate falsehoods, and typically comes from governments. While today there's a proliferation of non-state actors who specialize in the spread of disinformation. Whereas the old models of even the most egregious propaganda, adopted by the Nazis and others, focused on a few core messages, the new ecosystem of disinformation is far more complex. Often it seems designed to muddy the waters, spreading so many untruths that people don't know what or who to trust, creating a kind of dysphoria which is perhaps unique to modern disinformation. According to Google, the term was little used before 2016, but that year, Google searches for disinformation went up fourfold. It's worth pondering the timing of this, coinciding as it did with the two major populist revolts in the English-speaking world, the election of Donald Trump and Brexit. It also coincided with the dawn of what historians such as Neil Ferguson have termed Cold War II, with the emergence of Russia and China as serious challenges to US global dominance. Over the next 6 years, Google searches for disinformation went up 30-fold, which begs the question, was there 30 times more disinformation during that time, perhaps flowing from emboldened states seeking to undermine American dominance, or is something else at play? Is the term perhaps also being used by actors in the West as a way to explain or delegitimize developments in the political arena socially that they find unpalatable? In other words, does disinformation come not only from rogue states, but also from within? And if so, how do these streams interact with one another? I know some of our panelists, Marcin and Elon in particular, have some insight into the media's role in this phenomenon. As the term has grown in prominence, there has been a blossoming of new industries, of fact-checkers and disinformation experts, who have tasked themselves with policing the borders of objective truth. This can be vital work in an online world awash with distortions and half-truths. But these people are journalists, like most of us on this panel, with their own biases, only now they are cloaked in the garb of impartiality, which raises the question, who fact-checks the fact-checkers? Lastly, new forms of information, from OSINT to AI, to war bloggers and citizen journalists, have disrupted the traditional news-gathering process. This is both a tremendous opportunity and peril for journalists who can't be in all places at once, but must be able to verify the information they're seeing on social media, often at speed. This throws up a challenge for the news business, which places a high premium on accuracy, but also on getting there first. So, how are journalists adapting to these new realities, and where is our industry perhaps failing to do so? Now, I'd like to open it up to the panel, who will each have around 5 minutes to speak, hopefully allowing time for your questions at the end. Julian, I think it'd be good to start with you, as you've dealt with some of these newer sources of information and found them to be valuable. Could you, and when each of you are speaking, could you try and inform the audience on how you respond to things, you know, dubious sources of information in real time in your given roles? And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. I like the term citizen journalist, which you just used, which was really, I would say, hyped in 2016, but not so much anymore. Now it's more OSINT. And I called myself a citizen journalist in 2015, 2014, before I turned into professional media. But I never stopped using the information I did back then. And this is all kind of information on the field, all kind of information which is available to me, which I think should be available to the public. And from what you just described, I mean, the term disinformation is quite tricky, because disinformation is sort of information which is out there. And my firm belief is, ever since I'm a professional journalist, and I use this sort of information, mainly focusing right now on the war, on the Russian war in Ukraine, that we still have to use all kind of information, including all disinformation, all propaganda, all PR, everything on the market, to get the real full picture of what's happening. And I think this is very controversial, because first, of course, if you just, for example, watch my daily show on YouTube, then you think, why is he spreading Russian propaganda videos? Why is he using Russian army footage to show what's happening in eastern Ukraine? And I understand that at first you think, why is he doing this? Why? I mean, we know they are doing this to influence us, and we know they are doing this to give us a certain impression of what's happening. But my answer would always be, you have to use this information, not unfiltered, of course, not uninterpreted, not unanalyzed, but you have to use it in any way to get the full picture, which means, and this is very, very basic for journalism, and it has nothing to do with this new sort of media, and new sort of OSINT or whatever, you have to cross-check what's happening. And if, for example, the Ukrainian government, and you can read this in today's report from the general staff, they are always beating back the Russians, always. They never, ever lost a single village in their daily reports of the general staff. The Russians just made unsuccessful attempts, and they beat them, and they repelled 31 attacks in this village and this village. If you only use this official information, which I think is valuable information because it tells you where the Ukrainians are putting their focus right now, you would get the impression that the Russians never advanced in Ukraine. They have no chance. So what we need to do is using all kind of information from bloggers, as you said, from army units, and there are many volunteer army units, luckily producing a lot of video footage every day, to verify what's happening, and to see the government, and I would say the Ukrainian government, information as a baseline, as a fundament of what we are looking at, and then see drone footage from Ukrainian army, from Russian units, and so on, to see what's really happening. And this can be in many ways. I just give 2 examples, so you see it can be bad and good. And then I think my 5 minutes are already almost over. Just yesterday, the Russian army published something which they called a successful assault. And they said, see, our little Chinese buggies are going to this trench, and then we are going inside, and then we are pounding them. And they were really proud. They were publishing this. They said, this is our success. But then we looked at it, and we saw, wait, step back, what's happening here? The guys are going into the trench, and then from the same direction you can see tank fire just over the field going into the same trench. So it was actually a case of friendly fire. The Russians were shelling their own troops. either because of bad information or bad coordination, or because they just didn't care. They just wanted to destroy this trench no matter what, 10 soldiers, more or less, no problem. So this is one case where we used the Russian video. It can be seen on our homepage now, but with a totally different interpretation than what the author, the sender, the propagandist wanted us to say. So this is one case, but there are also other cases. And there are unfortunately many, many instances where the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian government were pretending they were holding cities, they were holding towns, and it's still under their control, talking about Soledar, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and many others. And then you had Russian footage showing that they were on the right western outskirts, and they had their flag, Marinka very recently, they had their flag on the very eastern outskirts of it, or Novomikhailivka, or many others. And you could question this. And this is, of course, very, very controversial, because if we publish this, then some in Ukraine especially are saying, you're spreading Russian propaganda. According to our president, we're still holding the town. Why you're saying something else? And this then creates the awkward situation that sometimes, and more often I have to say, Ukrainian media is quoting us as German media, because they're not allowed to quote Russian media, to say, well, maybe not everything our government is telling us is exactly, at least at this point, at this time, what's happening on the ground. So I think it's again, just to conclude, I think it is important to use all information, also false information, propaganda information, which is out there to deceive people, to then, of course, with the knowledge, you need the knowledge, you need to geolocate, you need to know what is a Ukrainian tank, what is a Russian tank. That was in 2014 a big question, now it's less. And how does it look like if they shoot each, or which weapon at each other. But if you know all this, and if you know the front line, and if you know how to analyze it, I think Russian disinformation can be very useful, as well as Ukrainian information, to get the whole picture of what's really happening in the war in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, unfortunately.
Thank you, Julian. Elon, it seems that not all disinformation is created equal. Some of it finds a broader audience and is amplified by certain mainstream media channels more than others. I know in the context of Israel, we had the Al-Ali hospital explosion last year. Could you talk about your experiences meeting this kind of a challenge as a spokesman for the Israeli government?
Hello, I'm Elon Levy. I was an Israeli government spokesman for the first half year of the war with Hamas after the October 7th massacre, trying to fight Israel's side in the media in a landscape defined by a willingness to automatically believe anything Hamas said and automatically disbelieve anything Israel said. And this was particularly frustrating after October 7th, when Hamas massacred and abducted hostages, promised to do it again, and then immediately denied that it had massacred and abducted civilians. At that point, the entire international media should have understood that Hamas is not a credible source of information, and yet they continue treating it as such. You mentioned the Al-Ahli hospital incident, which is a fantastic example of how Hamas managed to spin the international media around its little finger. Unfortunately, in the 7 months that have passed since, it appears the media has not learned anything. Here's what happened. 2 weeks after the start of the war, Hamas put out a press release saying that an Israeli airstrike had destroyed the Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza, killing 500 people. That headline went around the world like wildfire, while the Israeli media was still trying to work out what actually happened. It turned out it wasn't an Israeli airstrike. It was a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket sent from a nearby cemetery, and the shrapnel had fallen on the hospital. It hadn't destroyed the hospital. The hospital was still standing. It had hit the car park. And not 500 people had been killed, but it appears it was only in double digits. But by then, the story had gone around the whole world, and it was too late for the international media to admit the mistake that they had made. And so instead of correcting it and saying we got played by Hamas, it got spun into a he said, she said game and became something of a whodunit. And here we see a recurring pattern of how Hamas exploits the international media to do its job for it, which is to put pressure on Israel, generate international pressure to get it to stop the war, abandon the hostages, and leave Hamas in power. There's an established pattern. First of all, Hamas will make an outrageous and unsubstantiated allegation, like an Israeli airstrike on a hospital, like a massacre against civilians waiting to receive flour, like so many other examples, mass graves at a hospital. Sometimes it uses the United Nations in order to launder its information for it. Take the example of UNRWA. UNRWA is the Palestinians' own tailor-made refugee agency. There are 2 refugee agencies in the world, one for everyone else and one only for the Palestinians. It's staffed 99% by Palestinians, with only a very small cadre of international officials. UNRWA has been entirely complicit with Hamas to the extent that Israel found a Hamas server farm, a whole server farm, located 20 meters under the main UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, leaching electricity from the UNRWA offices above ground. And Hamas will use UNRWA in order to put information out. And as soon as it has a stamp of the United Nations, it gains credibility, and people will say this is coming from the United Nations, even if it's coming from Hamas. Here's what Hamas does. First, it puts out a crazy allegation. Immediately, Al Jazeera, the mouthpiece for the Qatari regime, will amplify it and put out a headline quoting Hamas, a terrorist organization. Immediately, social media goes aflame based on reports from Al Jazeera, and these accounts are amplified by the bots and trolls funded by Iran, Russia, other totalitarian regimes. As soon as that begins to gain traction online, the mainstream media have to react. And the mainstream media will parrot the original Hamas lies without any independent verification because they don't have a presence on the ground, quoting sources on the ground. What sources? The same sources that are operating from hospitals, for example, that are controlled by Hamas. The United Nations then gets forced to issue its own response and say we're deeply concerned by reports of, and all these reports are an allegation that Hamas has made and thrown out into the ether. And we've seen this happening so many times over the last 7 months until a narrative is established that it's too late for Israel to fight against. Because by the time Israel puts out its own statement, by the time independent OSINT investigators look over the data and work out that what Hamas was saying was nonsense, it's too late and the narrative has already been established that Israel created mass graves in a hospital in Gaza, or Israel committed a massacre against civilians waiting to receive humanitarian aid, or the airstrike on the hospital, which many people still believe. There is a consistent problem that Hamas does this using, one, the media on the ground. There is no independent media in Gaza. There is not one journalist, not one brave journalist, as the international media call them, who have produced a single headline out of Gaza that is inconvenient to Hamas. Not one headline from a journalist in Gaza inconvenient to Hamas. Why? It's because the journalists there are either, in the worst case, complicit with Hamas or members of Hamas, or cowed by it because they know they're not operating in a free reality. And the same goes for the sources, and I'll just conclude on this point. We had, for example, allegations coming out of hospitals inside Gaza from doctors. The same doctors in hospitals who on October 7th stood by and applauded and saw hostages being brought into the hospitals and then told the international media that Hamas wasn't in the hospitals. And these are the sources that international media keep repeating because, as you said, there's a race between accuracy and being the first to report a story. And unfortunately, from my experience trying to fight Israel's corner in the international media, the lesson is that the media is far too keen to get a story first, to create a sensational headline, if I'm being less generous, to create negative headlines about Israel to suit the journalists' own agendas and interests in the war, at the expense of accuracy and reporting the facts, which show a completely different picture from the outrageous allegations that the Hamas terrorist organization uses and launders through the international media.
Thanks, Elon. That raises a few fascinating questions about access. Accessing live war zones has always been tricky. That's nothing new, but I understand that it's become more tricky in recent months in Israel and Ukraine. I know from my own experience reporting, blogging about Ukraine, that access to photographs of soldiers in the field has dwindled. We can't, the copy that's coming in on the wire system is a lot more paltry than it was at the very beginning. So I think that leads us quite nicely on to Thomas and Melissa. You've both noticed this in your own reporting in Israel and Ukraine. And I think starting with Melissa, could you just explain, how you're seeing this, the problem of access, and then the knock-on effects it has to, relying on secondary sources of potential gatekeepers, as Elon says, whose motives we might question.
Sure, and I think Elon really hit the nail on the head here. A couple of weeks ago, I was watching the Jon Stewart show, which has made a comeback in the States, and he was interviewing CNN correspondent Christiane Amanpour. And she said, in somewhat candid remarks, that there are no independent journalists operating on the ground in Gaza. And she was quickly corrected by Jon Stewart, who said, there are Palestinian journalists. But the reality is there are no journalists who can operate freely. The role of journalists is to hold government to account, is to reveal things that would normally go under the radar, that would not normally be seen. And there was no free press in Gaza on October 6th, on October 5th. You would never see a headline critical of how Hamas was redirecting the millions of dollars in aid that they were getting every single year. That never happened before October 7th, and it certainly hasn't happened now. But on the issue of access, it's no secret that Israel has made it difficult for journalists, whether they are foreign, whether they are Israeli, to access Gaza. And that's been a real problem, and perhaps to Israel's own detriment, because the only people who are on the ground, who are reporting what is happening, if they work for a TV station, that's not an independent TV station. It's a Hamas-run TV station. If they're working for a newspaper, that's not an independent newspaper. That's a Hamas-run newspaper. They aren't able to be critical of what is going on. They aren't able to be critical of their government. They aren't able to point out very basic things like Elon said, that there were doctors in the hospitals cheering on the hostages that were being brought in on October 7th. And it's a very dangerous game. But there's more to this. So I flew in from Tel Aviv last night, and my phone started going off as we were taxiing on the runway. And then everyone else's phones started going off before we had taken off. And I heard people start gasping. I heard people, sighs of relief. The woman next to me put her hand to her chest, and I looked on my own phone, and I got a push notification that Hamas had just accepted a ceasefire deal. And I can't even begin to say, for anyone who lives in Israel, for anyone who is Israeli, for anyone who knows families of the hostages themselves, people who were killed on October 7th, how closely everyone in that country is following everything that is going on in regards to the hostage situation and the ceasefire negotiations. And to see that Hamas has accepted a ceasefire, we all got the push alerts, New York Times, CNN, BBC, Sky News, everyone got them. It took about 15 minutes before we realized Hamas hadn't accepted the ceasefire deal. They had accepted a ceasefire deal, one that Israel had not agreed to, one that the US had not signed off on. And so all of a sudden, there was this new narrative, and it was spun in a matter of 20 minutes. It's shorter than a sitcom. that Hamas accepted a deal, Israel said no to it, and all of a sudden, that's what everyone in the world is seeing. It's very dangerous. And I used to say in the beginning of the war, I would say to my friends who live in the States, there are two wars going on. There's the one here in Israel where I'm running from rockets, where people I know have been killed. And then there's the one you are fighting, which is the media war. And that one's bad too. But they're two separate wars. And as time has gone on, I no longer think that. They are so linked, they are so intertwined, that what is happening and the way that it is being conveyed to an international audience, you only have to look at what's been going on American college campuses the last 2 weeks to understand the impact that disinformation has on young minds who don't know any better, who look at this as a very black and white scenario. They are shutting down college campuses. They are canceling graduations. They are disrupting the president of the United States when he speaks. That's all happening because of disinformation that is coming out of Gaza and Israel. And there has to be some sort of way to tamp down on that. And if there's not, then it makes me worried for the next few months. It makes me worried for any future conflicts between Israel and its neighbors. And it makes me worried for the future of the free press.
Thanks, Melissa. I'd just like to follow up with, once that message gets cut through and then people like yourself understand it's more nuanced than that, do you think that for a large portion of people who've read that, the damage is done, and that any sort of follow-up explanation that they might hear, they might not have access, they might not see it, or once you start having to try and explain something to somebody, certain people who are suspicious by nature or maybe conspiratorial, they're like, smell a rat, and they say, oh no, well, I saw this. What's your impression of the sort of damage that does to the global conversation?
Think about when you read a newspaper, right? You see a headline, and normally what you remember from a story is the headline. You don't notice the correction buried on page A18, at 3 days later, correcting what this massive headline, top of the fold, said days prior. And I think you can look at the U.S. Congress, the example that Elon gave at the hospital. For weeks and weeks and weeks after, a member of Congress, Rashida Tlaib, kept blaming Israel for the hospital attack, even though multiple independent analyses had been done, clearing Israel, attributing blame to Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But it didn't matter, because once it is out there, and there's no reining it back in.
Thank you. Thomas, since the Ukraine war has got underway, the access to information has shifted significantly. Could you explain a bit about what it's like being there on the ground or reporting on it on a day-to-day basis, and how you've adapted to the lack of access?
Thank you very much for this question. And since I've been covering war in the full-scale invasion in Ukraine since the very beginning, because on February 24th, 2022, I was with Ukrainian soldiers in Donbass, actually a few kilometers from Russian positions. And of course, at the beginning, it was paradoxically pretty easy for journalists to cover what's happening. Of course, the first days and weeks were very chaotic. However, the access was pretty free. It was not formalized. So journalists were joining different units. They were reaching different spots close to the front line. But of course, there was not like there was a trench war, so the front line was changing rapidly. So it was also very dangerous for journalists to travel alongside the front line, because it was difficult to envisage where Russian forces are deployed. And like my first observation was that Ukraine was very successful in using journalists to spread a message across and to keep the attention of the global public opinion. So Ukraine effectively used journalists to tell the story of atrocities committed by Russian forces in Bucha, Irpin, Izium. Ukraine was also very effective in using journalists to tell the story of success of Ukrainian army as a successful counter-offensive in Kharkiv region in the fall 2022. However, I noticed that the situation has started changing, I would say, beginning of 2023. And of course, that was the time when Ukrainian counter-offensive has stopped, and the war of attrition has started. So, and also at that time, Russia regained the offensive actions in the front line. So winter 2023 was pretty hard for journalists. The access was limited. Of course, you need to receive media accreditation to work as a war journalist in Ukraine. However, this press accreditation is definitely not enough to reach the front line and to work with units on the front line, you need to apply to commanders of units. Currently, you also need to apply for commandment of army on the south or on the east or on the eastern part of the on the front line, and it's getting more and more complicated. And unfortunately, I got the feeling that Ukrainians realize that because the situation is very complicated, it is currently not so advantageous for Ukrainian side to report about the real situation on the front line. So Ukrainian army is trying to limit the access for journalists, and it's getting extremely hard to get any footage or any interviews that are really independent while being on the front line. That's why very often journalists are trying to work, maybe not clandestine, but using different tricks. For example, joining volunteers and going there as a humanitarian aid. Yeah, it happens because it is the only way to get closer to the front line. I can give you two examples from my work when it was really ridiculously difficult to get the information. The one when I was trying to do for the evening news service Wiadomości. It used to be main evening news service of the first channel of Polish national broadcaster, and I was trying to to tell the story of women in army, women serving in the front line, like paramedics, but also women working as drone operators in artillery and in different places in the first front line. And I managed to find 4 protagonists that decided to give the interviews. I even receive a consent from their commanders to intervene them, but I was not allowed to film anything else but talking heads. And of course, also the entire interviews were very thoroughly checked by press officers. So I knew that they are checking what the protagonists, what these female soldiers can tell me, but I was not able to film them while working on the front line. Like, for instance, operating drones or, for instance, operating artillery. So finally, after a few days of extensive interviews, I realized, okay, I got some stories. They are personal stories, pretty emotional. However, I didn't get the footage. And I can't broadcast in a main evening news service only talking heads. Ladies and gentlemen, sorry, it's not enough for the audience. We need some footage, we need some action, we need to film it. And we're not allowed. I still can't understand the decision behind, the rationale of the decision, of this decision, but we're not allowed to film anything more. The other example was last autumn when I was shooting the documentary movie about Russian war crimes against Ukrainian cultural heritage. So in this movie, Erase the Nation, we are telling the story of different atrocities committed against cultural sites, but also people of culture. So it's not a very military topic. We are not covering any news stories or development of what's happening in the front line. However, of course, we had to reach to the places that are very close to the front line. For instance, the city of Kupiansk, the city that was liberated in 2022. Currently, this is the frontline town. So we get there because there is a museum that was hit by Russian missile strike after the liberation of Kupiansk, because Kupiansk was on the occupied territories. And in this missile strike, the director of the museum and her co-worker were killed. However, and the missile hit directly the office of the director. However, we learned that during this missile strike, there was a third woman inside this office that survived the direct hit with S-300 missile. She was seriously wounded, but she decided to give us an interview. So we found her in the city of Kupiansk. It was a few months after the missile strike, so she was able to speak. She agreed to give us an interview. Her boss, so like the director of the Department of the Culture in the city, gave us the permission. We were even supported by Ukrainian Ministry of Culture that said we can make the interview. And we went to this demolished museum. We almost switched on the camera, and suddenly the head of the military administration of this city came over and said, "No, you are not allowed. This is the military zone. You can't do any interviews." And I said, "Come on, but we are trying to make an interview not with a soldier, but with a civilian employee of cultural department of this town." He said, "Still, this is the zone of military administration. I'm not allowing you," and that's it. And even though we were trying to call his commander, we were trying to call Ukrainian Ministry of Culture, we are fighting for 2 weeks to make this one interview about the women who survived S-300 missile strike, we're not allowed. So, of course, it's difficult to understand what's the rationale of this decision, but it was for me like this clear message that was sent to journalists that anything you would like to do is controlled by military administration, sometimes on the very regional level, and you can deal with it. It would be way easier if we decided to go there as a volunteers saying, "Oh no, we are just delivering here humanitarian aid, so yeah, and we delivered it to this lady, so that's why she's saying just thank you to the camera." And that's what's happening. And my final point is that I am pretty sure that currently Ukraine is losing the information war because global public opinion is more and more tired of war in Ukraine. There are more current topics. This is the first reason. The second reason is that journalists are discouraged from going to Ukraine because the access is so limited. So Ukraine used the momentum during the first phase of the war, but currently I think that Ukraine lost the track how to communicate what's happening in the front line to the global public opinion. And as Julian mentioned, that there is multiple sources of information particularly in the internet. We are like overloaded with the information. However, I think that usually this information at the present moment, this information reach only to the people that are really interested in the topic. We as a journalist, we are in the bubble. We are making this information to ourselves because we are so sure that, oh wow, everyone is so interested as we are. No, that's not true. I live partially in the US. I'm trying to talk to the people. Most of them don't know what's happening in the front line. A lot of people in Poland don't know what's happening in Poland. Okay, there's an ex-community of Osint people and their followers. Yeah, they know more or less what's happening. But still, this is only a fraction of the society. So we get a multiple sources of information, but in fact, we don't know what is happening, and the public opinion, that's my guess, sorry for this very pessimistic conclusions, is not interested about what's happening in Ukraine. It's becoming another forgotten war. That's the same what happened about war in Donbass in 2014, 2015, after the surge in interest. And after a few months, people just decided, okay, it's not what we are interested in. So war in Donbass became a forgotten one, and that's what's happening to Ukraine. Unfortunately, partially thanks to the, in my, of course, opinion, incorrect information policy of Ukrainian army.
Thank you, Thomas. So, to use a cliche, nature abhors a vacuum. When there's an absence of information, as we're hearing here, other things will fill the void. I think that brings us quite nicely on to Katerina, who has been documenting Russian disinformation in Ukraine and more broadly, and will hopefully have some specific examples for us on how its campaigns have changed over time and what sort of strategies it uses.
Hello, everyone. I'm Katerina Soprun from Militarny. It's Ukrainian media about war and about Ukrainian army, first of all. And I I agree with all what I hear there. It's all true. It's difficult to get information from frontline, not only for international journalists and for Ukrainian journalists too. We try to work with all administrations which can give confirming for us to work, but it's hard. And Russia used disinformation not only in Europe, not only in the United States and everywhere. They use disinformation inside Ukraine too. It's very difficult to us because in Ukraine, people know Russian language and they can influence for us. But they don't know Ukrainian language. It's our weapon because we can easy check that it's not true, and it is true, or something like that. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion occasion, so they use online translation of some disinformation message, and this translation is not okay. It was a little bit funny, and Ukrainians make memes, and it was funny really. But now they try to use people in occupied territories who know Ukrainian language, who can share information in Ukraine, and it's look like it's true. So it's no accent. It's absolutely okay. It's difficult to check. To quickly check. So, a few days ago, there was some case when they share video with young man who was in Ukraine military uniform, who says something, "Mom, I'm near Robotino, I will die, goodbye, I love you," something like that. He was all in Ukrainian flags, in his helm, in his uniform, everywhere. Of course, soldiers in front line, all in Ukrainian flags. There was some time when check that it's not true. He's not an Ukrainian soldier. It's a young man from occupied territory who was shooting on this video, and of course, not enough people check this. A lot of people share this. And then when you try to say that it's not true, it's not Ukrainian soldier, it's very, very long time, and a very small part of people who understand it. It's very difficult for us. Of course, they use disinformation to try to influence on frontline. For example, Russian war correspondents say that they get some village, small village, and of course Ukrainian soldiers, they read this information in social media, and they need time to confirm this information too. Of course, intelligence, of course, some war information, but it's emotional. So you don't sure that everything okay near you. It's some emotional things. It's of course works too, and civilian people and under pressure too. For example, Russians use disinformation, like share information that air attack preparing for some day or something like that. And this information shared like my neighbor, friend work in general staff or Minister of Defense, and he said that they prepared. It's never worked, but it share. You don't believe official information. Oh, they try to keep something for us or something like that. It's worked too. And they try always be more better in sharing this information in Ukraine. We try to to fight with them in this battlefield, information battlefield, but it's difficult too. And sometimes there is no time to work with international media, international journalists, because we need to check and fight inside for information about us, for our people, because it's difficult too. And one else thing that's they share a lot of disinformation about Ukraine in Europe and United States, and we need to try stay true about us and there too. For example, interview Putin for Tucker Carlson. So all what he said there about history, it's absolutely myth. It's only his opinion, but we need to try to say how it was. This is history, it's a facts, it's a documents, it's not so difficult, but of course not a lot of people interesting to look inside, to watch something interesting about this. So for example, I heard such information. So woman from Portugal heard something about this interview Putin for Tucker Carlson, and she say, wow, he know history so good. Oh my God! And you can't do this nothing, because she don't able to open Wikipedia. She didn't need it. It's okay for her, but we need a lot of sources and a lot of money, of course, to spend for and protect Ukraine from this myth. It's difficult for us, of course, and I want to say thank you for my colleagues who are working in Ukraine, try to show everything how it looks. And it's not Russian propaganda, it's really true how it works, how Ukrainian people live under air attacks in small cities near front line. It's very important. And it's difficult because Russia works a lot, not only in 2022, not only in 2014. It works a lot of time for share disinformation about Ukraine and share some advertisement information about Russia, how they are cool. So, and we all near Russia is something like small Russians. Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, or a lot countries around. So it's difficult for us, but we are fighting in our frontline, information frontline. Thank you.
Thank you, Katerina. Now, this is perhaps not something we think about enough. Can dis or misinformation create a false sense of optimism? Perhaps about Ukraine's progress at various stages in the war, and what's the sort of tangible damage that can do to somebody's morale, say in Ukraine or elsewhere, and also more broadly their trust in mainstream Western media. Marcin, I know you have some interesting things to say on this.
Yes, false sense of optimism in Poland at the beginning of full-scale Russian invasion. Before I start, I'd like to shortly refer to what Tomek said about difficulties for journalists to get to the front lines right now. Yeah, I've been reporting this war since its very beginning, which is 2014, and only during last year I just having the accreditation. I'm just hiding it, and I put the volunteer patch, and I get to the front lines, to my sources, and so on. And what is absurd, as a journalist, I have all the problems with filming, with interviewing. As a volunteer, no, I can film whatever I want. So, getting back to this false sense of optimism. Well, I will. I want to say that the disinformation, misinformation, doesn't necessarily come from the foreign agents like Russia or malicious inside sources. Sometimes it comes from well-wishing people who are incompetent, who build their careers of experts as business models, lack of control mechanisms. And all of it leads us to the situation where the lines between journalists and wannabe journalists, experts and wannabe experts, OSINT experts and wannabe OSINT experts, these lines just blur. I will use partially my example, but this is also the example of my colleagues who at the very beginning of the invasion went to Ukraine. I was already there in Kiev when it started, and well, I was planning to go there just for a week, but I stayed for 2 months. 2 months during which I didn't have a lot of contact with what was happening in Poland. There was so much work for me to do. I was usually working in the front lines. The access at the time, as Tomek said, was very easy. I was spending time practically in the trenches with the soldiers, and we just heard this huge disproportion of fire between Russia and Ukraine, of course, to the advantage of Russia. I talked to officers on all levels, from regular soldiers through field officers, high officers, politicians. So we had all this overall picture, and the picture said the situation is bad. The situation is bad. After these 2 months, I was coming back to Poland a bit depressed. I thought, okay, now we have to inform, just to say that we as the West need to work harder here. And I was so surprised, shocked even, when I came back to Poland and I saw that huge part of public opinion was just euphoric, positively euphoric about incoming Ukrainian victories. And on the other hand, Russians were presented as stupid idiots, well, plainly suicidal. Were almost preparing to some, I don't know, victory parade in Moscow here. And I thought, what happened? I looked out to the social media, and I found out lots of newly created YouTube accounts, Twitter accounts, people. Well, I work with war, with the army, and I didn't know these people. And they presented themselves as experts, as OSINT experts. And they were creating this false picture, yeah. Sometimes because they were incompetent, sometimes they were well-wishing but still incompetent. Sometimes that, well, that was what public opinion wanted, and they had their accounts as business models. Also, people who knew the situation, me, Tomek, my colleagues, war correspondents, we were not so much available because we were in Ukraine, and these people were here in Poland, not crossing Ukrainian border, and they had all the time in the world for the media, for interviews, and so on. So yeah, that created that false optimism. And we paid a lot in the following months for that.
Thank you, Marcin.
Just one remark. I
I would like to open it up to the floor for questions, so just briefly.
Just remark, I remember that when you were informing that the situation on the ground is not so optimistic, you were accused on social media that you are spreading a pessimism, that you are undermining the spirit.
Russian propaganda.
Russia propaganda, that was really ridiculous. Yeah, but that you are going like counter to this national euphoria, and people really wanted to believe that the situation is way better than it used to be, and that's why I think currently so many people is so surprised that unfortunately a Ukrainian army is struggling to survive instead of conducting successful counteroffensive.
Thank you very much, guys. I'd like to open up to the audience now if anyone has any questions. Could we go to this chap in the front row?
Hello, fascinating panel. So we can think that one of the solutions to fake news on the internet is the fact-checking. And ideally, if there is a fake news that appears somewhere on the internet, there's an instant fact-check. But of course, the devil is in the details. And as the moderator said, the system of fact-checking has a group of cloaked experts who very often have a bias. And I often see that there are certain parts of the political spectrum are fact-checked, and there are certain parts that are not fact-checked. So that is clearly a problem, and that is not the solution. I think the platform that does it the best is X, formerly Twitter, with the community notes. There are, of course, problems because there are bots, there are moderators, there are government actors, etc. Yet the community notes are absolutely brilliant. I have a group of friends who are moderators. We're very involved in that. But the problem is still the time. So, for example, there could be a fake news, let's say President Zelensky doing a very silly dance. Immediately, people spot on the internet that it's a digitally altered face, that it's not the president. And then it takes about 6, 8, 10 hours for the community note to be added, which says, this is not President Zelensky, this is a fake dancing video. And it works, and it's very good, and it's citizen sort of journalism, etc. But the problem is, in these 8 hours, it can already have 1 million, 2, 3 million views. And Mr. Elon Levy mentioned that as well, that after a few days, nobody knows that this is a fake video. So what is the solution? How can we improve these systems?
Thank you. Can we just get one more question? This chap here. And then I'll open it up to the panel.
I just want to ask if you are prepared for future for massive disinformation campaign from China, because we talk about Russia, it's the main problem now, but in the future will be China. China have a very advantage tool in every phone in the Western country of young generation. And my question is if we are prepared for China challenge in the future.
Great. So we've got 2 questions. One about bias in the fact-checking industry, and second about China. Who'd like to go first?
Can I start with the first one?
Sure.
Okay, very shortly. I mean, I think it's not so much about fact-checking of a certain video. It's more about the bubble. It's more about the opinion which appears, because people are always watching the same videos. They are always watching what they want to see. And the problem is, and this is exactly what you guys said. You remember 1 year ago, what was the main narrative in X when it came to Ukraine? I can tell you, it was Crimea beach party in August. That was the main thing. It was driven by politicians. It was driven by lots of OSINT people, lots of memes and so on. And now we are 1 year later. What is the main narrative now? Well, they need 30 years to Kiev in this pace, you know? And this is the main thing. It's not about a single video showing that a Russian soldier gets killed, because Russian soldiers are getting killed every day, that's true. But if you're only watching videos of a Bradley shooting at some Russians and killing them, or drones killing 50 Russians every day, you get the impressions we are winning the whole time. And I think it's not about this one video. Does it really show what it means? But it's about a wider context to each of the videos.
Indeed, the phrase "it will be over by Christmas" comes to mind. Would anyone like to go? Yeah,
please.
Sure, I'll jump in. To the first gentleman's question about fact-checking. The problem is, what sources are the fact-checkers able to refer to? We might say UN experts. One of the challenges that we've been facing in Israel is that so many UN experts have not been neutral observers reporting facts. They are people who in many cases have adopted the Palestinian narrative, see their role in the war as putting pressure on Israel to stop and leave Hamas on its feet because they regard it as a form of legitimate resistance. One example is the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese. I think the only UN expert who has been condemned by France and Germany after she denied that October 7th was an anti-Semitic massacre. The French and German foreign ministries had to condemn her for that. She will be regularly cited as a UN expert, although it's very clear that she sees herself as a combatant in this fight, taking the other side and not being an objective source of information.
Thanks.
Then the fact checkers have to really get to the specific details and not just the names. And as for the question about TikTok, China, we're not remotely prepared. And I can say that from our experience in Israel, Israeli content creators are tearing their hair out, that TikTok's algorithm seems to be deliberately suppressing their content. And someone in Nowheresville, Canada can record a video saying, Israel's committing genocide, and it will go viral on TikTok. And Israeli content creators who go down to Kfar Aza, to Be'eri, record themselves sharing what happened on October 7th, find that it's just not getting off the ground. I don't know to what extent that's deliberate. I don't know to what extent it's the human moderators who are suppressing that content. But it's a very serious question, the fact that we have young people addicted to a platform that is ultimately overseen and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party.
And you also mentioned the deepfake video, and of course the AI is developing rapidly. However, I deeply believe that one of the most effective methods of countering disinformation and also deepfake is having more journalists on the ground. Journalists delivering authentic footage, moving footage with authentic people telling their stories. There is nothing more compelling than authentic human story. We need journalists, we need storytellers on the ground. The problem is that it is expensive. Do you know how many permanent correspondents on the front line leading Polish media have currently? 0. I'm not talking about the correspondents in Kiev. I'm talking about the correspondents on the front line. We are a frontline state, and our leading media don't have anyone who is permanently deployed to the front line as a war correspondent, video journalist, delivering us authentic footage. I know it's dangerous. I know it's expensive. I know it doesn't generate profit like entertainment in a TV. He's in Kiev currently. He's in Kiev, of course, he's in Kiev. He's a permanent correspondent of First Channel. He's going to the front line. But
permanent?
I think currently he's a permanent, but in Kiev. And like half a year ago, First Channel of Polish national broadcaster, they got always 2 correspondents, one permanent correspondent in Kiev covering political issues and a frontline team traveling to the frontline. It has changed. And yeah, so let's say half permanent frontline correspondent. Come on, in the frontline country with the populations of almost 40 million people. So I would say we need more journalists on the ground and more authentic footage.
Yeah, go, just be brief, because I think we might get another question in if we...
Small commentary. I know it's dreams, but I think that very important media literacy for all, because it depends on how you use information, where you read information. It's important, and it's education, first of all, from kindergarten to university. So, and we should work with it too, and everything that say colleagues, it's important too, of course, because journalists is professionals, it's real information, and of course we need time to say what we want to say, to prepare some material, but social media don't help us.
Thanks, Katerina. So maybe one last question from the audience, if anyone has one. This gentleman over here.
The production of the fake news has never been easier, unfortunately. And these fake news are very, let's say, professional, very well crafted, I would say, very consistent. And using AI, for instance, It can be a part of a huge information campaign. So the question is, and we will not prevent people to see, to watch those messages, those news. And the question is there any approach within the media community to harness, to engage AI for tagging, for checking for the fake news?
Who'd like to take that? That's a tricky one. From my own experience, I think we're a little bit behind the curve on that one. We're a bit squeamish about using AI, but does anyone else have any?
No, I mean, I think you're right on. We are squeamish about using AI the same way we're squeamish about using ChatGPT. You know, it goes against the ethos of journalism. It goes against the idea that we are doing this in a real and authentic way.
There might be a niche role for it in detecting certain deep fakes and things like that, and I'm sure as those start to become more commonplace, that's going to be used. In my newspaper, it's probably above my pay grade. Yeah, thank you very much, guys. That was a fascinating discussion, and let's have a round of applause for our panelists.
Dziękujemy za uczestnictwo w panelu i zapraszamy na krótką przerwę.